What's up, everybody? It's your good friend Lukie, and this is my new YouTube channel. Please subscribe to help me. Look on the screen. Don't be a reoccurring viewer. Only 25% of the people watching these videos are subscribing. Hit the bell icon. Subscribe now, please. What's up, everybody? It's your good friend Lukie. I actually recorded this on Sunday, but I messed up the audio. So guess what? I get to think through my thoughts again. If you're enjoying these segments, be sure to subscribe to the channel as you saw earlier in the video. Hit the boop thumbs up and leave a comment if you think something about me is a little off or you have something to add to the conversation. That would be great. Let's get going right now. We have one of the most interesting prospect contenders, American breakout stars, and that's Jared Big Baby Anderson, the real Big Baby Anderson. He's taking on a less interesting opponent, in my opinion, that is Charles Martin coming up this weekend. Charles Martin's taking the fight, I want to say on 11 days notice, but don't quote me. It's around in that time frame. Charles Martin is a former world champion. The way he won his title against Glassoff is probably one of the most unmemorable heavyweight fights ever. For those that don't remember, it was on the Deontay Wilder versus Artur Szpilka fight card, in which Szpilka basically tore his ACL. Martin was accredited with a punch that actually didn't land. Martin becomes the world champion, and then his next fight, he gets brutally stopped by Anthony Joshua in 2 rounds. It's a very forgettable world title reign, and Martin was actually a very good amateur. He's a very good fighter. He hits very hard. He has some solid wins over people like Gerald Washington, but he struggled against the best fighters. He lost to Kownacki. He lost to Luis Ortiz. Despite dropping Luis Ortiz and having a chance to possibly upset Ortiz, Martin has been a guy who's been able to get into these situations to land big fights, but he's always struggled with kind of the marquee main event fighter. That's been the story on Martin. Jared Anderson, 14 pro fights, 14 knockouts. He looks like the first breakout heavyweight we've had in some time, maybe since Deontay Wilder. He's the most exciting. He's the most exciting heavyweight I can think about that doesn't have an amateur Olympic pedigree. Most of the heavyweights that kind of Americans get behind, dating back to Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, these were Olympians. And I think that there is some maybe comparison, although unfairly, to the excitement around a guy like Iron Mike Tyson that there is with Jared Anderson, because he doesn't have that Olympic pedigree, but he's getting people looking as though he's a Keyshawn Davis or a Shakur Stevenson fighter, where people are looking at him as one of the 10 best fighters in this division before he's even taken those type of fights to definitively prove it. He's fighting guys like Jerry Forrest and George Arias, who typical solid heavyweight fighters would struggle against, and stopping them. And he's stopping them in ways where I think most fight fans are now viewing them as uninteresting opponents, which is quite a feat for a young fighter. Now, the one concern I have about Jared Big Baby Anderson, the real Big Baby Anderson, I keep leaving out the real in it. That's proper shade to Jarrell Miller, by the way, who calls himself Big Baby Miller. Great slight shade right there. Love a good shade throwing. The big thing that I'm worried about is Marcos Villegas, absolute great boxing journalist. He has a big successful YouTube channel called Fight Hub TV. If you've ever watched boxing interviews, you've stumbled across Marco's channel, because it's just a tremendous asset to all of boxing. Because of his viewership, he's able to get access to great fighters, and that gives him the ability to do what he does well, which is ask interesting questions. And from those interesting questions, us fight fans can get some answers. One of the more astute questions I heard from Marcos, and I greatly accredit him for doing this, because what he did was he asked Jared Anderson in some capacity about his passion for boxing, and Anderson said basically he's in this sport to reach financial goals. A little concerning for me. Jared Anderson is someone that I have been looking at as to carry the sport for the next 10, 15 years. He's someone that in a story that's coming out on Pro Box TV, we have a quote where Brad Goodman, matchmaker at Top Rank, viewed him as the biggest star in boxing potentially if he can get to a world title and achieve what he achieves. I agree with Brad Goodman. I think that Jared Anderson could be the face of boxing with his mixture of his personality, the dynamic performances, and the way he's able to connect with so many different people and be so interesting. I think we're looking at someone that could even be bigger than Gervonta Tank Davis. That being said, very cautionary to me that he hasn't even gotten to a world title yet, and there's already talks of retirement. There's talks of we're going to meet some financial stability. The reason this is a question for me is it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you have a hard fight. And when you have a hard fight, that's when things like, do I want to fight? Do I love to fight? That's when things come out. That's when we find out about the intangibles of a fighter. And if there is a lingering sense of doubt, if there's a, hey, I don't really fully want to do this, I'm not as invested in this as someone else, the motivations for money never seem to work. The motivations for money never seem to create that Muhammad Ali fighter. When you look at the greatest fighters in history, Floyd Mayweather says he did it all for money, but if you look at what he did, a lot of what he did was for legacy. A lot of what people can look at Manny Pacquiao coming back and forth and say it's for money. To be a truly great fighter, sure, we romanticize the money. We romanticize the journey. Oh, they just stumbled into the situation. You have to be a madman or a madwoman obsessed with legacy. And I guess my one concern is when I saw that headline and I watched the interview, I think Jared Anderson did one of the most thoughtful, and I hope that doesn't make him sound soft because there's nothing soft about Jared Anderson, but it was a very thoughtful and well thought out response to Marcos's question. But it was concerning because he was talking like a 30-year-old. And if you're typically a 23 or 24-year-old, you're coming out of college. And if you're talking like a 30-year-old, you're well ahead of the game. But in the fight game, when he hasn't quite had those hard fights yet, it's something that I'm now putting on my radar. I still view Jared Anderson as possibly the face of top-ranked boxing moving forward. But I'm also a little eyes raised, like hamburger eyes, big eyes, looking at, okay, what are going to be the motivations? What are the motivations for the next couple of years? Because to me, the faces of Top Rank right now, you look at, it's Jared Anderson, Keyshawn Davis, and Shakur Stevenson until others emerge. That's the faces right now based on the eye test, but really it's Jared and Shakur. Keyshawn has to kind of find his spot in there. This weekend, what I'm expecting, this is Jared's first fight, main eventing ESPN. He's also bringing the card back to Toledo, Ohio. I'm expecting greatness from Jared Anderson. I'm expecting him to put together a performance that's iconic. This is going to be a defining moment. I'm expecting a ring walk that's as iconic as any other ring walk that he's ever done in his career. And I'm expecting him to have a highlight performance where he stops Charles Martin. And honestly, in a perfect world, I'd expect him to call for some form of a titleist, whether it's Usyk or Fury or some top-named guy. I would hope that he has a name that he's willing to fight that's a step up. One name that I'm kind of thinking might appear, Joseph Parker. That's a name I'm kind of thinking. Former world champion, Charles Martin's a former world champion. If we could get a Joseph Parker fight versus Jared Anderson in a November-December date, that would be a wonderful end to Jared Anderson. And then his 2024 would be, that is his time to try to go after these world titles. And 2024, 2025 would be his moment to try to see, can I become a transcendent pop culture star? So obviously that's above my pay grade. I'm not part of the management team or the matchmaking process at Top Rank INC, but that's the way I'm looking at it from hardcore enthusiasts. Let's look at, on this undercard, we got really good co-main event fight between Arslanbek, can't pronounce his last name, and Raphael, also can't pronounce his last name. It'll be in the description. But what you got with Arslanbek is fought Carlos Takam. It was a very forgettable fight, if we're going to be honest. He has trouble, right? He's a guy who we know what gets him to the dance. He punches hard, and he's not going to really set up the power. So his power is kind of like a sledgehammer. It's gonna, if it hits, and it's really effective, and it's hard, and it chips the surface. But you kind of have to stand there. Sledgehammers are most effective when they're stationary objects. He's not proving that he's capable of really thinking with someone that can move around a lot, that's tricky, that has a lot of ability to cause issues in the ring. That being said, Raphael, I believe, is based out of Florida. I believe he trains with Glenn Johnson. We've interviewed him on my previous channel, ITR Boxing. Absolutely great. Shout out ITR Boxing, support them as well. And he's a tough guy, and he has a sense of meanness that not a lot of fighters have. To me, this is a real 50-50 fight. This is a prove-it fight. Arslanbek landed a top-ranked contract. He's been fighting on these Eye of the Tiger fight cards. I believe he probably has a co-promotional agreement. He's not quite looking the part of being a signed fighter to me just yet. And this is a pretty solid, stern test for him to kind of see where he fits into the heavyweight landscape, because he is a big puncher, he is a big guy, but this is a guy that he's fighting that you're going to need a little bit more than that. So it is a little interesting for me to see that right now. Couple of others on this undercard. We have Tiger Johsnon and Abdullah Mason, along with my man Dante Free Smoke Benjamin. Those guys are all good. If I were to say it, I'd say Tiger Johsnon strikes to me as a breakout superstar type fighter. He's a guy that I think is going to emerge in the 140 conversation. He's kind of the slept-on 140 pounder because he's had kind of a quiet journey. He's got a very good coach that's working with him, Prentice Brewer. PJ Brewer, one of the best fighters I've ever seen in the gym. He looked like Pernell Whitaker in the gym. He's working with him. Tiger, to me, is passing the greatness test every step of the way. He has a lot of in-ring talent. Just kind of comes down to how Tiger adjusts when he gets to the big moments. It's not a matter of if, it's when. I love these type of fights because each and every one of these fights, it's an assessment tool to see how he can adjust and improve. Tiger is not quite ready for those big fights just yet, but let's see how he's improving from his last fight. It's a different way of watching boxing when you're watching to see the development of a fighter rather than you're looking at the result of what's occurring. So I'm excited for that. Abdullah Mason, obviously a very, very spectacular fighter, a fighter that I think many people view could be a pound-for-pound fighter one day. He also has a lot of upside and potential. He hits extremely hard. There's a lot of organic excitement around Abdullah Mason. And I think that if you're unaware of Abdullah Mason, you should probably start watching him because he's going to start to get fast-tracked at a young age, I think, into the title conversation. He's going to be in some really compelling fights. I think a fight down the road that I hope we see is Abdullah Mason versus Floyd Schofield. Two very interesting fighters who I'm very excited to see if they were to match up, how it would go. Don't sleep on this subsection part of the card. Our friend Jahi Tucker taking on Nicklaus Flaz. A lot of people are like, who's Nicklaus Flaz? I've never heard of that guy. Well, Nicklaus Flaz fought a guy from 360 Promotions named Brian Sabello. I'm talking really fast and funny because I'm a funny guy. But this is yet another time where Jahi Tucker is fighting a really tough opponent very early in his career. Much respect to him. Now, there's two sides to look at this. I don't love... Anyone that knows me knows I don't love when people turn pro early. Jahi turned pro early. Not the huge fan of that because I feel like there's a level of maturity that fighters miss out on just being a young person when they turn professional and they have to fight with men. There's a part of the growing experience that I feel like a young child misses out on, and it hampers them as a fighter because they don't quite get their identity. I'm definitely more of a fan of the 19, 20, 21, even 22, 23-year-old turning pro because I definitely feel part of pro boxing isn't just figuring out how you're going to fight and your skill level. It's also figuring out who you're going to be for the next 40 years. Jahi is just taking these really, really hard fights. Nicklaus Flaz coming off the biggest win of his career. He just beat Nika, the sparring partner of Xander Zayas. I think Jahi is going to call out Xander all week. He's looking for the Xander fight. And Jahi really should be a guy that's starting to enter into the prospect of the year conversation, or in our case, one of these fringe contender guys, because he's taking the fights that put you in that spot. Now, the only thing to push back on Jahi Tucker is he taking a path that's going to accumulate some damage so when he gets into those big fights, it shows some wear and tear, or is Jahi Tucker a future superstar? I don't know. I'd like to believe he's a future superstar because I like him. He's always been nice to me. He's been a really solid guy. And I think he's just got a ton of personality. He's always stood out as just a unique boxing personality, and he's always stood out as someone where I'm like, I need more Jahi Tucker in my life. So I'm really hoping Jahi has those, because he has, to me, a lot of the elements Teofimo Lopez had early on in his career. Jahi Tucker organically goes viral when a lot of fighters try to go viral. There's something about him where he's able to connect to fans. So watch Jahi Tucker, because I think that he's going to be someone that you need to watch over the next few years. When we go to ESPN Plus, hand gesture, looking at things so I don't run over. Hand gestures are crazy. Savannah Marshall's taking on Franchon Crews. Franchon Crews, undisputed super middleweight champion. I think there's zero chance Savannah Marshall stops Franchon Crews. Franchon Crews is bigger and stronger than Savannah Marshall. If Savannah were to win this fight, it would just be her outboxing Franchon. I don't see her doing the traditional Savannah Marshall thing where she stops opponents. That being said, I can be wrong. I don't pitch shutouts with boxing predictions or takes. I have been wrong, but to me, this is a very interesting fight that's going to be under-watched and under-received, because they both have a comparable loss. The greatness of Claressa Shields is Claressa Shields beat Franchon Crews in her first fight and defeated Savannah Marshall 2 fights ago. Because of that, the elephant in the room is this is who is the person that's behind Claressa Shields in terms of this. I personally think Savannah's probably going to have success in this fight, but I also think Franchon's being very underrated. People are underestimating Franchon. She's had a very hard career where she's had to earn everything and kind of put herself into this position. I believe she works with Peter Kahn. Peter Kahn's done a masterful job maneuvering her to this point. This is a tricky one, right? Because I think the obvious thing is Savannah Marshall had such a good fight with Claressa Shields. A lot of people are going to go, okay, Savannah should win this, and then we're going to go to a rematch, and that's going to be compelling. But should and could doesn't dictate results. Each fight exists in a singular planet, and that's where things can get weird, because I think Franchon Crews is actually bigger and stronger than Claressa Shields, and I'm interested to see how Savannah Marshall deals with that. Tasha Jonas fights for the IBF Super Welterweight Women's title on this undercard. Talked to Dimitri Salita for ProBox TV News earlier this week, and that was something special, because he was saying Claressa Shields might be in the running to fight Natasha Jonas. Natasha Jonas, if she wins this fight, has tons of options. Claressa Shields, or she could fight Terry Harper. Both really, really interesting fights. That's probably the most notable undercard fight outside of Ben Whitaker, who's someone that if you're a fan of boxing and you don't mind watching British fights, I think Ben Whitaker is going to be the biggest British boxer at some point. He has the personality of a superstar, and he can fight his butt off. He was one of the most interesting fighters in the Olympics in 2020. His fight against Iman Kitov was absolutely that of legend. It was a tremendous performance, and I think Big Ben Whitaker is a guy that you need to start watching at some point. Keep him on your radar. You're probably not going to watch this deep undercard because it's going to be a little bit of a mismatch if we're being honest, boxing, talking, and all that stuff. Guys like Ben Whitaker, good for the sport. DAZN has a card this weekend. Probably not going to watch it. My guy Dakota will for sure. It's Dalton Smith, it's Pat McCormack, and it's Hopi Price. They're all in fights. I don't know a ton about any of their opponents. I didn't do much research. To me, it's really, this card is one of these guys has to hit for Matchroom. Is it going to be Dalton Smith? Is it going to be Pat McCormack? Or is it going to be Hopi Price? But one of them has to transition into a superstar at some point. That is what they are banking on. And we can sit here and draw straws on who it's going to be. A lot of people tell me they believe Dalton Smith is going to be the guy. Dakota, who I deeply respect, every Sunday makes my Sunday better when we do a podcast and talk boxing. He views him like a Carl Frampton. For me, Pat McCormack is a no-brainer. I see him as a Luke Campbell type that's more physical and aggressive, that has world championship ambitions. He was one of the best British fighters, if not the best male fighter out of the 2020 Olympic class. He just kind of has gone under the radar. Hopi Price has impressed me, but I've just stopped watching some of his fights. Sorry about that, but that's what that card's going to really be like. I think it's an assessment tool of who's going to break out. Finally, Esquiva Falco is fighting Vincenzo. I can't pronounce his last name. I believe it's on ESPN plus it's an IBF middleweight title. And this speaks to the bigger problem at middleweight is Esquiva Falcão is a really good middleweight fighter. And he's fighting in Germany because a purse bid probably happened and they put up the most money to fight in Germany. Because of that, this division is so inconsequential with the lack of big names. A world championship fight, what people aspire to, is just happening on a show that's going to not really be all that available to most people. It's going to happen off of the radar, and it's not going to affect much. Carlos Adames is the WBC middleweight interim champion. Probably will get promoted to the WBC middleweight champion if Jermall Charlo does in fact fight Canelo. But let's say after that fight, he also called out David Benavidez. We're not sure if Adames is even going to stay at middleweight. He might say, the heck with this, I'll just go to super middleweight. There's better fights there. Janibek is staying at middleweight, but he just can't get any fights. Really, what we're hoping for is, just because from fight fans' perspective, we don't know much about the guy that Falcão is fighting. Falcão has been a very underrated middleweight that really hasn't ever gotten a big push because he kind of hasn't really done himself favors either. He's never really had an out there personality or kind of drawn a ton of interest to himself. If he wins this fight, that could possibly set up a unification bout with Janibek, IBF, WBO champion. That at least starts to make something make sense in the middleweight division, where absolutely nothing makes sense, and it's just a very uninteresting division right now. It's not saying the fighters are bad. It's just not that compelling. The fighters don't make me want to watch boxing rather than go see the new Indiana Jones movie. And until fighters can do that, make me want to stay home instead of going to see a movie, the division's in trouble. This is Lukie. I broke this week's Boxing News Live segment into 2 parts. Let me know if you like it or if I should go back to the previous segment. Thank you for sticking around.